Tesla's Attic, chapters 19 and 20. Chapter 19, A Trunk of Lost Memories. Nick had been terrified of the Accelerati before he heard of Swedenborg's tale, and yet, finding out the Accelerati were even more powerful and dangerous than he had imagined, rather than increase Nick's terror, gave him an uncanny sense of relief. Knowing they could easily crush him like an insect posed the all-important question, why hadn't they? After all, if you see a spider in your room, you squash it, plain and simple, unless you have a reason to let that spider live. So it can catch flies, perhaps? Or maybe, as in the case of Madagascan silk spider, so it can weave valuable webs. For whatever reason, the Accelerati needed Nick, which put him at a distinct advantage because he definitely did not need them. They're looking for something called a far-range energy emitter, Caitlin said. She had come over unexpectedly late that afternoon, racing upstairs and into the attic. It was the first time in the universe's 13 billion year history that a girl had been in Nick's bedroom. Luckily, Caitlin was doing all the talking, or she might have noticed how, for at least the first couple minutes, Nick found himself incapable of speech. She first told him of her chilling encounter with the grand Accelerati himself, or Acceleratus himself, or whatever you call the leader of a lethal secret society. Then they began to discuss the mystery of the far-range energy emitter. You think it was something I sold at the garage sale? Nick asked. Caitlin shook her head. It sounded like something bigger. Not a thing, but a place. Some place Tesla built, maybe? Nick suggested, like Wardenclyffe Tower. In crunching facts about the mad scientist who now ruled his life, Nick had learned that Tesla began building a tower in New York, nearly 200 feet tall, with a giant copper sphere at the top. He quickly relayed the facts to Caitlin, how it was supposed to transmit electricity from the United States to Europe through the air, how it would have been the world's first wireless network, and even though he designed it nearly 100 years ago, it would have blown today's technology out of the water if it had worked. Unfortunately, Tesla ran out of money before it was finished. Well, whatever this thing is, Caitlin said, they're desperate to find it, which means we need to find it first. There are a lot of things we need to find first, Caitlin reminded him. Right. So what else did Jorgensen do? Well, he gave me some sort of crazy mind warp tea that made me remember all the places I hid my pacifier when I was like 2. It also made me tell the truth, but only about the things I felt like talking about. So he didn't get much out of me. I suppose if he had used a second tea bag, I might have remembered previous lives. Nick heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Nick's father returning home after his second triumphant day as the copy machine repair king of NORAD. He looked over at Caitlin sitting right there on the edge of his bed, thought of his father coming into the house, and he felt that knee-jerk reaction of being caught doing something he shouldn't, which annoyed him because he wasn't doing anything. And it annoyed him further that he wasn't. Whatever Jorgensen wants from me, Nick told Caitlin, I can't give him, even accidentally, because once I do, I'm in the drawer next to Swedenborg. And then he heard Danny shout from the bottom of the attic ladder, Hey, Dad! Nick's got a girl up in his room, and they're whispering secret stuff. To which he heard his father respond, About time. Nick would have turned beet red, but somewhere deep down, his subconscious mind decided it wasn't worth the effort. Caitlin stood up. I'd better go before any of my pets end up nuked. Huh? Long story. He would have seen her out, but his phone rang. Although caller ID claimed that Eleanor Roosevelt was on the line, it turned out to be Petula. I just want you to know, she growled at him, that I'm holding you personally responsible for what's going to happen tomorrow afternoon. And then she hung up loudly in his ear. Nick woke at dawn with an idea. It sent an adrenaline rush through him that he didn't have his usual morning sluggishness. He was dressed and racing down the stairs in 5 minutes, only to be stopped by his father, who, thanks to actually having a job, was also up at the crack of dawn. Where are you headed off to? His father asked, far more professional than usual in a coat and tie. Outside, Nick heard the rumble of trash trucks and the loud complaint of garbage cans being raised and unloaded into the hopper. With a sickening groan, he realized that this was trash day, which meant he didn't have much time to implement his plan. Morning run, he blurted. Really? Since when? Since now, Nick said, and he burst out the door before his father could ask any more questions. Trash trucks swarmed everywhere like some sort of metallic green invasion. Some of the streets Nick passed had already had their big plastic trash bins emptied, while some still awaited the inevitable. A truck was already on Caitlin's street when he arrived. Without a moment to lose, Nick flipped open the lid of Caitlin's trash bin and thrust his hands into the unpleasantness. Chopped onion and potato peels, duck skin in a dark red sauce. The mess clung to his arms and squished between his fingers. What were the chances he could find it? What were the chances it was even here? Nick dug through another layer of trash. The garbage truck was now at the next house, and the driver was eyeing him with malice, as if he might use his big hydraulic claw to pick up Nick along with the trash and deposit him in the hopper. When Nick looked up, Caitlin was standing there in starry night pajamas, looking at him like he had lost what little sanity he had left. Mind telling me what you're doing dumpster diving on my doorstep? It's not your doorstep, it's your curb. Finally, his fingertips touched a fine mesh with familiar consistency attached to a tiny string, and he extricated it from the trash. A tea bag dangling from his fingers, and the little tab that had a tiny A, symbol of the Accelerati. Tea time, he said cheerfully. A minute later, Nick was washing his hands at the kitchen sink, and Caitlin was setting the tea kettle to boil. They had quickly concocted a semi-plausible story for her parents as to why Nick was at her house so early. Something about having to document the calls of birds at dawn for science class. Would you like something to eat, Nick? Caitlin's mother asked. I can't imagine you had breakfast before coming here at this ungodly hour. No thanks, Nick told her brightly. Just some tea would be fine. The brew that Caitlin poured for Nick, however, barely resembled tea. It was pale and weak. I'm not feeling anything, he whispered to her after the first cup. Well, she pointed out, the bag's already been used. What am I supposed to feel? First, you'll feel healthy. Then you'll start remembering weird stuff and have an urge to tell the truth about it. After the fourth cup, with a weak tea sloshing around in his stomach, Nick finally began to feel a mild but undeniable sense of well-being. And then, a minute later, I was eating chocolate the first time I actually tied my own shoelaces. My favorite kind of baby food was string beans. I used to pick my nose and hide it under the kitchen table when I was 5. Ew! Nick really didn't want to be telling Caitlin these things, but once he started, he found it hard to stop. And then something that was both joyful and sorrowful came to mind. My mom smelled like magnolia blossoms at my 6th birthday party. Caitlin looked excited. Nick just felt weird, like he had opened a trunk of things he never realized he lost. He closed his eyes and got to the task at hand, the reason he had come over before the trash was collected. He thought back to the day of the garage sale. We sold 32 items from the attic, and then he started to remember to whom they had gone. There was a woman with red hair and a flowered dress who bought an old-fashioned dome hairdryer. He pointed at the notepad on the table, reminding Caitlin to write down everything he said. There was a brown Cadillac, dented fender, license plate FGT385. Is that the car that almost hit us? Caitlin asked. No, that was a gold Buick. He hesitated as the scene came back to him. The closeness of Caitlin, the warmth of her cheek against his as he saved her life. Got it, said Caitlin. Keep going. Nick reluctantly let the moment go and got back to remembering. The old washboard went to a bearded man in a Hawaiian shirt. He wore tortoiseshell glasses and drove a green Saturn that made a funny noise when it dropped into reverse. The effect of the tea lasted for about 15 minutes before Nick's memory began to slip. Soon he was back to normal, although normal felt pretty dense after a bout of total recall. You feel stupid now, right? Yeah, he confessed, even more than usual. She laughed at that. Together they looked at the information he had spouted forth. descriptions of people, vehicles, license plate numbers, and a whole list of objects that he hadn't even remembered selling. He didn't have addresses, he didn't have locations, but at least he had dozens of clues. If you saw these people again, do you think you would recognize them? Nick closed his eyes and tried to imagine that the people he had dredged forth from his memory. Now that they had been brought to the surface, he felt confident he could pull them out of a crowd. He nodded and Caitlin smiled. That's quite a list of bird calls you got there, her father said as he passed through the kitchen, casually glancing at the notepad. Yeah, said Caitlin, smirking at Nick. You won't believe the things I heard in this kitchen. As a rule, Nick was not the type to skip school, unless you count the pretending your runny nose is the plague because you didn't study for your science exam, boy. However, on this day, he was a blatant scofflaw, an unrepentant truant, spending his day on a reconnaissance mission around his neighborhood. He searched for the makes, models, and license plates of the cars parked on streets and in driveways, and for faces in the markets and strip malls, refusing to despair when he couldn't find anything or anybody all morning. Finally, around noon, the efforts began to pay off. After recognizing a license plate in a driveway, he rang the doorbell. He was greeted by a woman he remembered from the garage sale. According to the cheat sheet Caitlin had written up, she had purchased a set of old-fashioned hair rollers. Nick explained that he had accidentally sold some of these items that were of sentimental value and would be happy to buy them back at 1.5 times the original price. The woman was more than happy to hand him back the set of hair rollers. Never had a chance to use them anyway, she told him. I don't know what possessed me to buy them. Then she casually told Nick that one of her neighbors had purchased the dome-style salon hairdryer and was having problems with it. Nick discovered that the woman who had purchased it appeared to have a head slightly larger than standard human proportions. He had no idea if this predated her use of the hairdryer or not. Buying it back was costly because although the woman claimed to have it gave her migraines, she sensed Nick's desperation and insisted on being paid 3 times what she originally paid for it. In the end, he made a deal and struggled home with the bulky, egg-shaped device. As the day wore along, he managed to find the flat paddled electric mixer. It was being sold at a substantial markup in a thrift shop, but after that it all started to go downhill. He recognized an old man coming out of the grocery store and followed him home. Excuse me, Nick said, as politely as he could, just before the man went into his house. I think you might have been at my garage sale. The old man suddenly became jittery. You'll have to speak to my son, he said, and when he opened the door, standing there was a man in his 40s, clearly from the same gene pool. It's him, said the old man. I can see that, said the younger one. In the shadows behind them, Nick could see a boy about his age watching him suspiciously. Nick tried his tall tale about the sentimental value of the glass vacuum tube that the old man had purchased, but they weren't buying it. If my father did buy something at your garage sale, the middle-aged man said, and I'm not saying that he did, it's our property now. Yeah, said the kid behind him, so get lost. Nick heard a baby crying somewhere deep in the house. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have family matters to attend to, and he slammed the door in Nick's face. Nick made a note of the address. The man who had bought the tube clearly knew what it did, and he had shared that knowledge with his family. It might take some work getting it back, but at least now he knew its location. His final encounter that day was the strangest. He found a brown Cadillac with the dented fender sitting in front of an ordinary suburban tract home. A woman answered when he knocked at the door. Before he could say anything, the woman gasped. No, she shouted, it's mine. You'll just let me explain, said Nick. Go away or I'll call the police. And yet another door was slammed in his face. This time Nick was not going to be brushed off so easily. He pounded on the door. I just want to talk, he shouted. No response. He pounded again, a little louder this time. Then he heard a strange, high-pitched warbling noise from inside. He reached to pound on the door a third time, but his hand fell upon empty air. The door was gone. The woman was gone. In fact, the entire house was gone. All that remained was the cement stoop he stood on, a hole where the basement used to be, and pipes gushing water into the air like fountains, still believing that there was a sensible place to pump it. "You there," said a voice from behind him. Nick turned to see a pudgy man walking a pudgier dog. "What did you do to that house?" Nick ran and didn't stop until he got home. It wasn't until he was up in his attic room that he began to calm down. He had secured his bed and desk to the wall, but that didn't stop the sweet spot in the center of the attic from drawing him to it. More and more lately, he'd taken to lying on the floor, in that curious spot directly beneath the skylight, whenever he felt uneasy. The warmth and uncanny sense of connection soothed him. They put his concerns in perspective. He knew this must have been by design as well. He could imagine Tesla sitting in the middle of the room, using this nexus like a relaxing bath for his hyper-powered brain. If it could somehow pull furniture from the wall, surely it could gather the disorganized thoughts of a genius. But not even the calming nature of the attic could give Nick the perspective when an entire house did a quantum leap out of his neighborhood. "Breathe in, breathe out," he told himself. "Don't overthink it." And soon he had his racing thoughts under control. It was amazing how many unthinkable things he could store in his mind when he had no other choice. Petula, on the other hand, was deeply embittered by the things that she had to store in her mind. All day she had wandered through the school like a sulking zombie, partially because she had gotten no sleep, and partially because now she knew the future, and it was not pretty. To add insult to misery, halfway through the day she had lost her purse. This meant she had to walk home because the bus driver refused to let anyone on without a pass, even if he knew the passenger. She arrived home at T-15, counting and counting, and with a mounting sense of inevitability and dread. She fluffed the pillows at the end of the couch on the couch and waited. At T-5, the doorbell rang. She answered it to find Mitch at the door. "Gee," she said flatly, "what a surprise." "I found this at school," said Mitch, holding out her purse to her. "I think it's yours." "Wonderful. A member of a crime family attempting to be honest." "We're not a crime family. My dad was set up." "Whatever," said Petula. I suppose you want a reward?" "Well, I wasn't expecting one, but hey, if you're offering." "Just get in here and let's get this over with." She led Mitch to the couch, and when he didn't sit, she pushed him down on it. Mitch seemed a bit startled and perplexed, which just annoyed Petula further. "So," said Mitch, "nice house you got here." "Really?" said Petula. "Is that the best line you have?" "It's not a line. I really think it's nice." "I know what you're here for. Don't try to deny it." "But you'll have to wait precisely 1.5 minutes." "Oh," said Mitch, "really?" And then he added, "What am I waiting for?" As if you didn't know, she reached over and grabbed a crystal bowl of peppermint candies she had prepared in advance. "Have a mint," she said. "No thanks," Mitch told her. "I said have a mint." And Mitch, like a weak mind manipulated by the force, obeyed. "I prefer wintergreen," he said, chewing the mint to oblivion. "Deal with it," Petula said. Then she tossed her hair in that come-hither way that models do on TV, and her left pigtail smacked Mitch in the face. "Hey, watch it with that thing," said Mitch. She grabbed him by the shirt. "I want to be clear about this," she told him. "No matter what idea you've got in that pea brain of yours, this means absolutely nothing." Then she checked her watch, pulled him closer, and got down to the business of kissing. At first Mitch resisted, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer intensity and skill that Petula had cultivated, having practiced kissing her chihuahua on numerous occasions in preparation for the real thing. Everything being relative, Petula found Mitch's kiss to be far more appealing than her dog's, and she found it went on much longer than she had planned, indeed, much longer than was necessary to prove the validity of the camera. Mitch had long since gone limp, perhaps having fallen unconscious from the lack of oxygen. Finally, Petula pushed him away, handed him another mint, and herded him toward the door. "So," Mitch said, "want to go to the movies or something?" And although she found the thought disturbingly appealing, she told him, "This didn't happen. You will speak of it to no one." Then she kissed him again and pushed him out the door. The imaginary number I is defined as the square root of -1. It is the quantity that mathematically cannot exist, because no number times itself is a negative number unless that number happens to be Petula Grabowski-Jones. After her encounter with Mitch, Petula found herself so completely confused and illogical. She was the very embodiment of I. This sudden and unexpected attraction to Mitch Merlot flew in the face of all her plans. Her true goal was Nick. Furious at the treachery of her own emotions, she stormed out of her house with her camera, desperate to take pictures of tomorrow with Nick she knew she could create. She resolved that at precisely 4:30 tomorrow she would walk up to Nick's front door. He would answer it. Then she would crush his resistance with the same practiced power smooch that had rendered Mitch into mint jelly. She would steal his heart away from that flighty, artsy-fartsy Caitlin. Petula had no doubt in her mind she could make this happen. Now all that she needed were the pictures to prove her success. And so, standing in front of Nick's house, she snapped a series of shots of his front door. Then she ran off to Miss Plank's darkroom to develop them, convinced that there was nothing imaginary about her fantasy. But oh, what a difference a day makes, because the pictures, when developed, did not reveal a scene of romance triumphant at Nick's threshold. Instead, they revealed policemen and an ambulance and someone covered by a sheet being wheeled out of Nick's front door on a stretcher. Someone who, both in and out of focus, was very much dead. Chapter 20, Bonfire of the Profanities. Theo had no illusions that his relationship with Caitlin was going anywhere. They were from two different worlds, after all. She lived in a world of creative expression. He lived on Earth. She spent her time dreaming of how things might be. He spent his time on Earth. And although she kept making lukewarm overtures of wanting to keep it going, he had already checked out, using the express lane. Because when it came to a list of reasons for being together, it was certainly 12 items or less. Getting over Caitlin wasn't the issue, but he couldn't ignore the fact that she was giving her time to that new kid from Florida who couldn't pitch to save his life. Plus, Theo had to be reminded of him every day in science because the goofus sat right across from him. It made the class unbearable. To Theo, Nick was like a peanut lurking in the trail mix. Not that Nick was deadly enough to send Theo to the emergency room the way a peanut would, but he was, in his own way, a threat to life as Theo knew it. There was some high octane weirdness surrounding that kid, things that Theo couldn't figure out. Like maybe he was in the witness protection program, or an alien in the witness protection program. And the fact that Caitlin would abandon Theo for such a weirdo was a foul ball he simply could not field. It was on the day of the science lab earthquake that Theo decided to do something about it. Mr. Hoffman, the science teacher, had determined that everyone would present their lab projects throughout the year in alphabetical order, to the despair of Adam Aronson and Heather Ardmore. Then, safely nestled among the LMNOP block, he knew he could look forward to weeks of blissful procrastination before slapping together a half-assed household magic demo. Today's science lab was being presented by Jason Boring, as Theo liked to call him, although he knew his name was really Baring. "My project," announced Boring from the front of the room, "is a homemade localized earthquake machine that I myself designed from spare parts I found at home myself." Boring put what looked like an old-fashioned radio on the table in front of him. Across the aisle from Theo, Nick jumped up. "I object," he said. "This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Slate," said the teacher with a chuckle. "Just sit down and let Boring get it over with," Theo said, pleased to see Nick back off and sit. "Moving on," Boring said, twisting one of the device's two dials. "I just have to find the room's resonant frequency." "Don't you mean resonant frequency, Jason?" suggested Mr. Hoffman. "Yeah, that too," said Boring. As he kept twisting the dial, tuning in greater or lesser levels of static, Theo shouted, "If you could just rattle off Miss Flanagan's bra, I'll give you an A+." Laughter came from all around, even from the girls. "Got it," Boring said proudly, and he moved his hand to the volume dial. Theo felt it, first as a low-level rumbling to his gut. He could tell from the expression on Nick's face that he felt it too, although Nick seemed far more panicked about it. Then Theo's desk began to tremble, and it skittered a few inches away. "Now watch this," Boring said, as he turned the dial up a few more notches. The whole room started shaking, the light fixtures rocking back and forth as acoustic ceiling tiles dropped like giant snowflakes. As the earth beneath the classroom floor rose up and then dropped like the kamikaze roller coaster at Six Flags, someone started screeching like a maniac. The kamikaze was not Theo's favorite ride, and he wasn't 100% sure that he wasn't the one screeching. He was too terrified to do much of anything, and could only watch as Nick leaped for the device. With all the shaking, Theo doubted Nick would even reach it, but he did, and he turned it off. The tremors stopped and the room returned to more or less normal. Before he could even catch his breath, Theo watched Nick grab the earthquake machine, throw a dirty look at Jason, not so boring anymore, and run out the door with it. Principal Watt, unsure how to deal with this incident, closed the science lab for the rest of the day and gave Jason detention, claiming disruptive behavior. As a precaution, he also put Mr. Hoffman on probationary leave. In the meantime, Nick had managed to save the day. As far as Theo was concerned, that was like pouring salt into an open grave. Both Nick and Caitlin disappeared from school. Rumor was that they had ditched together. Now there was no question in Theo's mind that this was war, and it wasn't just a matter of who ended up the object of Caitlin's affection. All that mattered to Theo was who didn't. As far as he was concerned, Caitlin could devote her time and attention to anyone she pleased, except Nick Slate. Theo had already heard through the grapevine that Nick's dad had once been a professional baseball player. Such a thing, under different circumstances, would have brought him and Nick together as friends. And then Theo realized that, indeed, it still could, because it's like they say, keep your friends close in your enemy's closet. Nick had no doubt that if he hadn't shut down Tesla's earthquake machine at that instant, the entire school, maybe even the entire neighborhood, would have come crashing down around them. Tesla was clearly a genius, and he was also clearly out of his mind. "I can't believe you didn't feel it," he said to Caitlin as they hurried away from the school. "Well, I was at the opposite end of the building. If it had gone on for another 30 seconds, there wouldn't be any building." "Don't you think you're overreacting the teенsiest bit?" Nick stopped walking and looked at her. "I'm holding an earthquake machine in my hands." Caitlin looked at him, looked at the radio-like device, and said, "Point taken." They started walking again. "Can you imagine what the Accelerati would do if they got a hold of this thing?" Nick asked. "I don't suppose they need it to get an A in the Accelerati science fair." Nick took a deep breath, his resolve setting in. "We have to destroy," he said. "We have to destroy them all." The scorched earth policy is a time-honored tradition of war. Villagers about to be overrun by the enemy would burn their own homes and crops to deny the enemy shelter and food. Armies would destroy their own munitions to prevent their attackers from using their own weapons against them. The Russians used this strategy very successfully against a very irritated Napoleon, burning everything they had and retreating into Russia. And since there was no end of Russia to retreat into, Napoleon was pretty much screwed. Nick realized that he was now at war with the Accelerati. A very different kind of war, perhaps, but the principle was the same. They wanted to get their hands on this stuff, and like Napoleon's army, they were a force to be reckoned with. But like Napoleon's army, they could be defeated. The only way to beat the Accelerati was to get rid of the things they desired, fully and completely. 2 months ago, Nick had suffered through a fire that had taken the life of his mother, but today he was going to start one. Nick didn't have all the accursed items from the garage sale, far from it, but at least he could create a bonfire out of the ones that he had. He texted Mitch and Vince to come to his house with their respective items, saying that he'd explain when they got there, knowing that if they had any inkling about his plan to burn them, they'd never show. He and Caitlin went out to his backyard with all of Tesla's inventions, plus an ugly end table left by great Aunt Greta, because Caitlin insisted it was too hideous not to burn up. Now, said Caitlin after they piled the items up, we need an accelerant. A what? You know, gasoline or alcohol, something that'll make it all catch fire. Oh, right. Nick went into the house, but all he could come up with was a big jug of cooking oil. He came back out and showed it to Caitlin. Will this do? Any porch in a storm, Caitlin answered, as Thea would say. Nick untwisted the cap and prepared to pour the oil, but Caitlin reached out to stop him. You know, she said, for a long time I wanted to do a photo collage of random objects burning. Caitlin, this isn't one of your garb art projects. This is serious business. She looked at him insulted. Art is serious business. At least it is to me. I thought you'd appreciate that. I do, but if we're going to burn it anyway, Caitlin interrupted, can we at least make it aesthetically pleasing? I'll take pictures, I'll do my collage, and not only will it be a work of art, it'll be a spite bomb for the Accelerati. Will this take long? He asked, not bothering to hide his impatience. Caitlin didn't answer. She just went over to the pile of stuff and began rearranging it. If we tilt the reel-to-reel like so and hook the fan around the neck of the lamp, then we can perch the radio on top, its Gothic point recalling a church steeple. Nick held the jug of oil by his side and watched Caitlin creatively rearrange the objects. They actually have grooves that help them balance on each other really well, Caitlin noted. That's when something began to dawn on Nick. At first he couldn't be sure what it was, perhaps an inkling of intuition, perhaps a pattern that his unconscious mind had already begun to put together. But as he looked at the objects and the way that Caitlin was stacking them, it seemed he could tell where she was going to put the next object before she placed it. The notch base of the hair curler caddy fit perfectly into the top of the reel-to-reel player. The two odd, flat paddles of the electric mixer were perfectly spaced to fit the toaster. This was not a coincidence. I'm almost done, Caitlin told him. I just can't find a place for the bat or this big, ugly hairdryer. Caitlin, what was that thing the Accelerati were looking for? They called it the Far Range Energy Emitter. Why? I think we may be looking at it. Now, as they stared at the collection of objects before them, there was a sense of things almost snapping into place. Sure, some of the placements were wrong, and there was tons of parts missing, but each of these items from the attic, Nick realized, in addition to what it already did on its own, was somehow part of a larger whole. Caitlin visibly shivered, all the more reason to get rid of it. She tossed the remaining objects onto the pile, no longer caring about aesthetic placement. Then, picking up the oil jug, she moved forward ready to pour, but Nick stopped her. Caitlin, this was his life's work, his greatest accomplishment, right here under our noses. Caitlin sighed. We're not setting it on fire, are we? Nick shook his head. He realized they had the upper hand. They knew something the Accelerati didn't. Let's take it apart, he told her. Let's take it apart before anyone can see.